What's going on, everybody? Kalupis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 4G 2022. Now, if you do end up wanting to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about each phone, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch 90Hz PLS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 400, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. With the Moto G Stylus, we're getting a 6.8-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display. This phone also has a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 396, and a 20.5:9 aspect ratio. So in general, both phones do have really good displays for being more entry-level devices, but in a couple more subtle ways, the Moto G Stylus does have an advantage. First of all, at 6.8 inches versus 6.6, as you can see, the Moto G Stylus is a bit larger, which does tend to be a good thing if you're going to be on your phone a lot. And with the 20.5:9 aspect ratio versus only 20:9 with the A14 5G, the Moto G Stylus has a slightly taller and more narrow form factor, so if you're doing something in landscape mode like watching videos for example, with the Moto G Stylus you're going to get a slightly more immersive experience, and for stuff like web browsing and social media, with a taller form factor like this, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. But in general, again, these differences are pretty subtle, so honestly no matter what, despite the Moto G Stylus having some slight advantages here, if you're looking for a more entry-level phone that has a really nice display, either phone is going to be a perfectly fine choice. Now for storage, with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, this phone is getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and with the Moto G Stylus, this phone has 128GB, and this phone also has microSD card expansion, so clearly here, the Moto G Stylus having double the storage does have quite an advantage, so if you're someone who's constantly downloading stuff like apps, games, things like that, or maybe you just never want to have to worry about space, in that case, the Moto G Stylus will be a better choice. But that being said, with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, with 64GB, although I personally really consider this the bare minimum, and I would definitely not get a phone that has less. For the average user, I do think it's at least going to be okay, so as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone, and you're not downloading a ton of apps and games and stuff, you should at least get by. But again, of course, if storage is really important to you, the Moto G Stylus will have an advantage. For security features, both phones do have Face Unlock, and they both have fingerprint scanners right here on the power keys, so definitely great placement there. But starting with the A14 5G, let's go ahead and give them a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the Moto G Stylus. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, both phones do have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. For the camera setups, with the A14 5G, we got a water drop notch for the front-facing camera. This camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the Moto G Stylus, we got a nice looking hole punch design for the front-facing camera. I personally feel like this one looks a lot better. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera that also doubles as a macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So first of all, for the overall features, the Moto G Stylus having an ultra-wide camera does have an advantage because unfortunately for whatever reason, Samsung didn't give the A14 5G an ultra-wide camera. So if you do want to get those wider angle photos, then you might want to go with the Moto G Stylus. And I really do think it's interesting that they combine the ultra-wide camera and the macro camera. The Moto G Stylus and the Moto G Stylus 5G 2022 are really the only phones I've ever seen do that. I don't really know how it works, but it is really cool. So definitely nice there. That being said though, really feature-wise with the A14 5G, the ultra-wide camera is really all it's missing. So if you don't really care about the ultra-wide camera, then of course the setup here is going to be perfectly fine for you. And when it comes to photo quality, I feel like these phones are really similar. For what it is, I was really impressed with the A14 5G. The photos I took with this phone did come out really well, but really the same thing could be said for the Moto G Stylus. I do think both phones take great photos, and especially if you don't really care about the features like the ultra wide camera and stuff like that, I feel like for more casual use, if you're taking pictures for like Instagram for example, either phone is going to get the job done perfectly fine. But again, if you do want an ultra wide camera, then keep in mind, the Moto G Stylus does have one, whereas the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G doesn't. Now, when it comes to RAM and processor, with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the Exynos 1330 processor. With the Moto G Stylus, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G88 processor. So a couple things here. First of all, obviously, with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, as the name suggests, this is a 5G phone, whereas the Moto G Stylus, or at least this Moto G Stylus, is only a 4G phone. Despite this though, the difference in performance really isn't as much as you might think. Sure, on one hand, the A14 5G is technically a faster device, and honestly, the difference is pretty significant. If you're going to be on your phone a lot, you will definitely notice the A14 5G is quite a bit faster. But that being said, the Moto G Stylus, especially for being a 4G phone, is really not slow at all. And for more basic activities like web browsing and social media, for example, or maybe maybe if you're just watching a bunch of YouTube videos, for that kind of thing, this phone is going to be perfectly fine. But again, if you're going to be on your phone a lot and you really want the faster phone between the two, then keep in mind, the A14 5G is still noticeably faster, and of course, if you do want 5G connectivity, then that's definitely a plus for the A14 5G too. Now, I did run benchmark tests on these phones using Geekbench 5, and here are the results I got. So again, as you can see here, the A14 5G does have quite an advantage, but that being said, again, I do want to point out, despite how these results may look, in my experience, the Moto G Stylus is actually pretty fast for what it is, and again, for more basic activities like casually browsing social media, stuff like that, the performance we're getting with this phone is still going to be perfectly fine. But again, of course, if you want the faster device between the two, then the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G will obviously have the advantage. For the battery, both phones do have 5000 mAh batteries, so with either of them, you can expect to get great battery life and longevity. If you're in a situation where maybe you're not always around a charger and you need a phone that's really going to last all day, then one of these phones is definitely going to be a great choice. Now, as far as the software goes, this is an area where the A14 5G has a huge advantage. With this phone, we are getting Android 13 straight out of the box, whereas unfortunately with the Moto G Stylus, this phone only has Android 11, and seeing as this phone has been out for over a year at this point, I'm pretty sure it's not even getting Android 12, let alone Android 13. Whereas with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, not only are we getting Android 13 with this phone, but knowing Samsung software support, you can also expect to get several other major updates in the future. Now with the Moto G Stylus, the Moto G Stylus 5G does have technically better software support, but yeah, as far as the 4G version goes, I'm pretty sure with this phone, you are just going to be stuck with Android 11. So if having the latest version of Android is important to you, then clearly here, the A14 5G will be a better choice. Another thing to keep in mind is that with the A14 5G, this phone does have NFC, whereas unfortunately, the Moto G Stylus doesn't. And keep in mind, the Moto G Stylus 5G 2022 does actually have NFC, and in a lot of ways, that phone is really similar to this one, so definitely don't get the two confused. But yeah, in general, if you do like to use tap and pay, then you are going to want to go with the A14 5G, because again, this phone does actually have NFC. But if you don't really care about that, then this is probably not going to be a big deal. But speaking of other features, of course, as the name suggests, the Moto G Stylus does actually have a stylus, whereas the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G obviously doesn't. So if you do want a phone that has a stylus, then the Moto G Stylus is not only going to be the better choice here, but in this price range, it's really one of your only options. So again, if you do want a stylus, definitely keep this in mind. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, this is actually pretty close. You would think that with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G being a newer phone that is a 5G phone versus a 4G phone that's about a year old, you would think it would be an easy win for the A14 5G, but honestly, the differences between the two are actually pretty balanced. On one hand, with the A14 5G, yeah, this phone does have 5G connectivity. It's also significantly faster. It not only has the newer version of Android, but also much better software support, and it does have NFC. So if those things are important to you, then definitely keep this in mind, because in that case, you are going to want to go with this phone. But on the other hand, with the Moto G Stylus, this phone again does have a slightly larger display, and it does have better dimensions too. And while these differences are pretty subtle, if you're consuming a lot of content, especially if you're using your phone primarily to watch videos and stuff like that, it will still make a difference. In addition to this, the Moto G Stylus again does have double the storage with 128GB versus only 64 with the A14 5G. The Moto G Stylus, in my opinion, does also have a better camera, because while the photo quality is really similar, if not pretty much the same, this phone also does have an ultra-wide camera, whereas again, unfortunately, the A14 5G, despite having a macro camera, doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. And again, obviously, the Moto G Stylus does have a stylus, whereas the A14 5G doesn't. And while it's maybe not the best stylus in the world, it still does get the job done. So if you want to use the phone for like taking handwritten notes, and then just navigating through your home screen and just using the phone as a phone, for that kind of use, the stylus is definitely a nice feature to have, especially considering, again, unless you're with like T-Mobile or Metro, where the TCL Stylus 5G is an option, the Moto G Stylus and the Moto G Stylus 5G are really your only options when it comes to having a phone with a stylus that's not something like $1,000 flagship phone. So this is definitely something to keep in mind too. But in general, at the end of the day, if you want a newer phone with better performance and features like NFC and 5G connectivity, the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G is going to be the best choice here. But if you want a slightly better display for consuming content, a stylus, a better camera setup that has an ultra-wide camera, and a bunch of storage, the Moto G Stylus 5G is not a bad option either. But this concludes my comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 4G 2022. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about each phone, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.